December 20th, 1940, just after nightfall, at RAF Hucknall Aerodrome in Nottinghamshire, England, and a German pilot sits in the cockpit of a Hawker Hurricane fighter with his hands moving across unfamiliar controls, trying to figure out how to start the engine before anyone notices what he's doing. A mechanic has just walked away to fetch equipment for starting the aircraft, and in those few seconds of solitude, the pilot works frantically to understand the British instrument panel he's never seen before, fingers tracing over switches and levers that might as well be written in a foreign language. Squadron Leader Boniface appears alongside the aircraft with a revolver aimed at the pilot's head and orders him out. The pilot accepts defeat. A steps down from the cockpit moments before he would have attempted to steal a Royal Air Force fighter and fly it back to Germany. This wasn't his first escape attempt, and it wouldn't be his last. Franz von Werra became the only Axis prisoner of war to escape from Western Allied custody and return to combat during the Second World War. A man who made 4 separate escape attempts across 2 continents, crossed a frozen river with his bare hands in the middle of a Canadian winter, became a brief celebrity in a neutral America that didn't yet know it was about to enter the war, and traveled through 7 countries across 20,000 miles to get home before dying 7 months later on a routine patrol when his engine failed over the North Sea. July 13th, 1914. It's brought Franz Baron von Werra into the world in the Swiss town of Loch in the canton of Valais, born to parents who carried an aristocratic title but owned almost nothing to justify it. Baron Leo von Werra, his father, had declared bankruptcy, and under Swiss law, the relatives of a bankrupt family were legally required to help support the children, turning Franz and his 5 siblings into financial burdens distributed among extended family who hadn't asked for them. What his parents did next carried a brutal practicality that defined everything about Franz's early life. They sold him and his sister Emma to an aristocratic German family, and the children were raised in Cologne, separated from their Swiss heritage and remade as Germans in a country that would shortly give them opportunities Switzerland never would have. 22 years old in 1936, Franz joined the Luftwaffe at exactly the moment Germany rebuilt its air force in violation of the Versailles Treaty and needed young men willing to fly the new fighters rolling out of factories that weren't supposed to exist. Von Werra's personality made him a natural fit for the fighter pilot role in ways that had nothing to do with his flying skill, which remained competent but not exceptional, boisterous, given to what his contemporaries called playboy behavior, utterly untroubled by self-doubt, and possessed of an imagination that extended to boasting about kills he hadn't actually scored. Von Werra cultivated the image of the dashing fighter ace with the same enthusiasm he brought to everything else, and at his fighter base, he kept a pet lion cub named Simba as a mascot, which tells you most of what you need to know about the kind of man he was. May 1940 brought the shooting war, and von Werra scored his first confirmed victory by shooting down a Hawker Hurricane during the Battle of France, claiming 2 more bombers before the Luftwaffe turned its attention to Britain. August 25th, 1940. Gave him his best day of the war when he claimed 1 Spitfire and 3 Hurricanes shot down in air combat, plus another 9 British aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing runs, numbers that made him a fighter ace by any standard and brought him to the attention of the German propaganda machine looking for heroes to celebrate. Whether all of those claims were accurate is a different question entirely, because von Werra's relationship with the truth had always been flexible when the truth made for a less interesting story than the alternative. September 5th, 1940, ended his combat career in a field in Kent when his Messerschmitt B F-109 crashed after being shot down by what may have been a combined effort between British pilot Gerald Stapleton and Australian pilot Patterson Hughes, though some accounts suggest friendly fire brought him down, and the 2 Allied pilots simply claimed credit for a kill that wasn't theirs. The exact circumstances disappeared into the confusion of the Battle of Britain, but the result remained unambiguous. Von Werra crash-landed at Love's Farm, and an unarmed army cook from a nearby unit walked over to the crashed fighter and accepted the German pilot's surrender without carrying so much as a rifle. Within days of capture, von Werra had already attempted his first escape, and what happened at Maidstone Barracks by the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment set the pattern for everything that followed. Put to work digging and given a pickaxe, he immediately tried to use it as a weapon to overpower his guard, military police private Dennis Rickwood, who carried only a small truncheon and faced down a German pilot swinging a pickaxe at him with the kind of courage that doesn't get mentioned in the official histories. The escape attempt failed immediately, Rickwood subdued him, and von Werra found himself moved to more secure interrogation facilities at Trent Park in Hertfordshire, a country house that had belonged to Sir Philip Sassoon before the war and would become a teacher's training college after it. 18 days of interrogation at Trent Park produced little useful intelligence because von Werra had figured out that the British were bugging conversations, and he remained careful about what he said, mocking the surveillance by openly discussing the obvious methods they were using to record prisoner conversations. At the POW reception center, he made a wager with his RAF interrogator, betting that he would escape within 6 months, a timeline that turned out to be optimistic by about 1 month, but not by much. Eventually, the British sent him to POW Camp No. 1 at Grisdale Hall in Lancashire, a facility between Windermere and Coniston Water that housed elite German prisoners, including large numbers of captured Kriegsmarine officers, earning it the nickname U-Boat Hotel among the guards who worked there. Grisdale Hall's prisoners took daytime walks outside the camp through the village of Satterthwaite, and during these walks the group always stopped at High Bowkerstead Corner, a routine that von Werra studied with the attention most people reserve for problems that might kill them if they make a mistake. Major Fenelsa, the senior German officer at the camp, had asked the British commandant to change the timing of these walks from 10:30 in the morning to 2 in the afternoon, claiming the morning schedule interfered with educational classes the prisoners were conducting, and the British agreed without understanding they were being maneuvered into a schedule that better suited an escape attempt. October 7, 1940, brought the moment von Werra had been waiting for, and at the regular stop, a fruit cart provided what the British later described as a lucky diversion, while other German prisoners covered for him. Von Werra slipped over a dry stone wall into a field, while guards were distracted by land girls working nearby, whose frantic waving got mistaken for fraternization rather than alarm. The count at the end of the walk registered 23 prisoners instead of 24, and that's when the guards realized someone was missing and alerted local farmers and the home guard to begin searching. 5 days of freedom in the English countryside followed, von Werra moving through farmland and fells, while hundreds of searchers combed the area looking for him, and on the evening of October 10th, at around 11 o'clock at night, 2 Home Guard soldiers found him sheltering from rain in a hoggarth, which is a small stone hut used for storing sheep fodder that's common in that part of Lancashire. When they removed him from the hut, he knocked their lamp to the ground, extinguishing the light, then disappeared into the darkness before they could grab him. October 12th brought the end when he was spotted climbing a fell. The area was surrounded, and searchers eventually found him almost completely submerged in a muddy depression in the ground, exhausted, filthy, and out of options. 21 days of solitary confinement followed, and on November 3, 1940, the British transferred him to Camp No. 13 at Swanwick in Derbyshire, also known as the Hayes Camp, where he immediately joined a group of German prisoners who had already begun digging an escape tunnel and were looking for additional men willing to risk it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next at Swanwick is even more audacious than anything von Werra has tried so far. Swanwick Tiefbau, AG, which translated roughly as Swanwick Excavations Limited, was the tongue-in-cheek name the group von Werra joined had given themselves, and the men involved included Major Heinz Kramer, Lieutenant Walter Monhard, Lieutenant Wagner, and 2 others named Wilhelm and Malashevsky, who had decided that digging their way out represented better odds than waiting for the war to end. November 17th, 1940. Marked the day they started digging in a disused room in the north wing of the garden house, working toward a patch of waste ground on the far side of 2 security fences and the lane that ran between them, calculating that 13 meters of tunnel would put them beyond the wire and into cover provided by trees and bushes growing on ground the camp didn't maintain. 1 month of digging produced a tunnel that still exists today at the Hayes Conference Center, and while the prisoners were working underground, a separate group of forgers inside the camp produced fake identity papers and counterfeit British currency that would let escapers move through England without immediately being identified as German POWs the moment they tried to buy anything. The plan came together with a precision that suggested these men had been thinking about nothing else since they arrived, and on December 20th, 1940, shortly after the final roll call at 20:15 hours, 5 prisoners slipped into the tunnel while German bombers attacked Derby and anti-aircraft guns opened fire across the countryside, the noise and confusion providing exactly the kind of cover the escape needed. The camp choir burst into song at the same moment, singing louder than usual, belting out Musi den, zum Stadeli hinaus, which translates as, I must away into the great wide world, a song choice that amused von Werra enough that he remembered it decades later when people asked him about the escape. Wearing a beret and pajamas over the top of his Luftwaffe flying suit to keep the suit clean while crawling through dirt, von Werra made his way through the tunnel and emerged in the meadow next to the haze, where he and the other 4 escapers had to lie still, while civilians from the surrounding area walked up and down the path that ran alongside the waste ground. And once the civilians had passed and the area was clear, the 5 men went their separate ways with a pledge to meet again in Berlin. An agreement that would prove optimistic for everyone, except von Werra. Kramer and Manhard stayed together, intending to walk to Summercoats and catch a bus to Nottingham before making their way to the East Coast. But they took a wrong turning, and Kramer found himself captured quickly in South Normanton, followed shortly by Manhard and the other 2 escapers. Von Werra had gone in an entirely different direction, alone, because what he had planned required working solo, and depended on a level of audacity that would have been harder to pull off with a partner second-guessing his decisions. And that's when he removed his pajamas so that he wore only his Luftwaffe flying suit, intending to pass himself off as a Dutch pilot serving with the Royal Air Force, enter the nearest British air base, and steal an aircraft to fly back to Germany. The plan required knowledge of current events so that he could bluff his way through conversations with anyone who questioned his story. And during his time at Swanwick, he had read as many English newspapers as the camp library provided, absorbing details about RAF operations and British military organization that a genuine Dutch pilot serving with the RAF would know without thinking about them. Conscious of the fact that British bombers flew at night while German bombers operated during daylight, von Werra waited by a barn until 3 in the morning, then made his way across fields until he reached a railway line where he encountered an engine driver and told him his name was Captain van Lot, a member of the Royal Dutch Air Force now serving with the RAF. And his story was that he had been on a bombing raid that night when his Wellington had been hit by flak over Denmark and he had been forced to crash land the aircraft nearby, after which he had walked to the railway looking for transportation back to his unit. The engine driver believed him, or at least didn't disbelieve him enough to refuse help, and von Werra made his way to Codner Park Railway Station in Jacksdale Village, where the complications began almost immediately because the signal box at the station wasn't connected to the public telephone system, which meant the man working there, Mr. Harris, suggested von Werra wait until 6 in the morning when Sam Eaton, the booking clerk, arrived with access to the phone in his office. 6 o'clock brought Sam Eaton, who listened to von Werra's story and wasn't happy with what he was hearing, feeling strongly that he ought to contact the police, which was exactly what von Werra didn't need. An hour of conversation followed, von Werra using every bit of charm and knowledge of current events he could summon to convince Eaton that he was who he claimed to be. And eventually Eaton agreed to call the nearest RAF base at Hucknall and arrange for a car to collect this Dutch pilot who needed to return to his squadron. But here's the thing. The police arrived first, summoned by someone who wasn't as convinced as Eaton had become, and they questioned von Werra about his story, with the kind of thoroughness that comes from taking regulations seriously, even when you don't fully understand what you're dealing with. And the police who arrived were inexperienced with interrogating foreign military personnel, and von Werra's extensive knowledge of British current events satisfied them that his story was genuine, which meant they were still questioning him when the RAF car pulled up, and an officer from Hucknall stepped out to collect this stranded Dutch pilot and bring him back to the aerodrome. Von Werra climbed into the RAF vehicle and got driven to Hucknall, which at that time served as the center of operations for No. 1 Group Bomber Command, a fact that would shortly cause his story to unravel because Hucknall wasn't a base where Wellington bombers operated and the people working there knew it. Arriving at Hucknall and claiming he was a pilot of a special squadron of Wellington bombers who needed to borrow an aircraft to fly back to Aberdeen, Von Werra watched the RAF personnel begin noticing details that didn't add up, and his flying suit wasn't regulation issue, which could be explained by his being a foreign volunteer, but the RAF deliberately kept him sitting by a roaring fire in the hope that he would have to remove the suit because of the heat, at which point they expected to see a Luftwaffe uniform underneath. When the RAF duty officer asked to see his identity tags and papers, von Werra reached for the forged tags hanging around his neck and discovered they had melted from his body heat, the metal or material they were made from, unable to withstand the warmth of being worn against skin for hours, and at that moment he realized his story was about to collapse. Squadron leader Boniface had left the room to check von Werra's credentials through official channels, which meant there were perhaps minutes before someone returned with confirmation that no Dutch pilot named Van Lot existed in any RAF squadron, and von Werra excused himself, ran to the lavatory, jumped out the window, and sprinted across the aerodrome toward the aircraft parked on the flight line, spotting a lone Hawker Hurricane sitting by itself and running toward it, encountering a mechanic who assumed from von Werra's uniform that he was one of the Air Transport Auxiliary ferry pilots who were often foreign nationals and frequently visited Hucknall to collect Hurricanes and fly them to bases around the country. Von Werra slipped away from that first mechanic and found a different one, telling this second man that Squadron Leader Boniface had ordered him to make a test flight and he needed help starting the aircraft. The mechanic, apparently seeing nothing unusual about the request, gave von Werra a quick explanation of the Hurricane's cockpit controls and then left to fetch a trolley accumulator to start the engine, and in those few seconds of being alone in the cockpit, von Werra tried desperately to absorb enough information about the unfamiliar British controls to get the aircraft started and into the air before anyone realized what was happening, but Squadron Leader Boniface appeared alongside the aircraft with a revolver aimed at von Werra's head and ordered him out. Von Werra accepted defeat and stepped down from the Hurricane, perhaps 30 seconds, before he would have attempted to start the engine, taxi out, and take off in a stolen British fighter to fly back to Germany. And within hours the British had transferred him back to POW custody with a note in his file that this prisoner required maximum security because he had now made 3 escape attempts in less than 4 months and showed no sign of stopping. The British decided they had had enough of Franz von Werra, and in January 1941 they loaded him along with roughly 1,000 other German prisoners onto the SS Duchess of York in a convoy departing Greenock, Scotland on January 10th. Guarded by HMS Ramillies, among other warships, bound for Canada, where the new POW camps being built on the far side of the Atlantic would put an ocean between these difficult prisoners and any chance of getting back to Germany, even if they did escape. But von Werra spent the voyage selling buttons from his uniform, his Iron Cross medal, and his Luftwaffe insignia to other prisoners who had money, accumulating cash he could use during an escape he was already planning before the ship reached Halifax. The key to everything he thought about was that the United States remained neutral in January 1941, which meant that if he could reach American territory, he couldn't be legally returned to Canada or Britain, and from American soil, he could make contact with German diplomatic personnel who would help him get home. January 21st, 1941, brought the ship to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and the prisoners got loaded onto 2 trains that departed in a whirling snowstorm, bound for a newly constructed camp on the north shore of Lake Superior, where the Canadians intended to house German POWs in a location remote enough that escape would be nearly impossible, even if someone tried. 25 prisoners sat in each train coach watched by 3 guards, and von Werra had arranged with 2 other German POWs to act as coordinated lookouts who would whisper "go" and "stop" each time they felt the guards were distracted or paying attention, giving von Werra a running assessment of when he could move without being immediately noticed. Around 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, January 21st, the lookouts whispered "go," and von Werra dove through the train window into waist-deep snow alongside the tracks, landing hard and rolling into a snowbank that cushioned the impact enough that he could get up and start running before the guards realized what had happened. 7 other prisoners tried to escape from the same train that night, all of them jumping from windows during moments when guards were distracted. And all 7 got recaptured within hours or days, rounded up by Canadian authorities who knew the prisoners couldn't survive long in the January wilderness without help. But von Werra's absence wasn't noticed until the next afternoon, when the guards conducted a full count and discovered they were one prisoner short, and by then he had already put substantial distance between himself and the train, hiking south through snow that in places reached his waist, heading toward the St. Lawrence River, which he knew formed the border between Canada and the still neutral United States. Near Smiths Falls, Ontario, roughly 30 miles from the St. Lawrence and about 100 miles from Ottawa, marked the location where he jumped, though some sources place him closer to Mont Laurier, which would have been 200 miles from the capital. And the exact location mattered less than the direction he moved, which remained consistently south toward the border. At dawn, he caught a sleigh ride with a Quebecois farmer who apparently asked no questions about why a man was hiking alone through the snow in the middle of winter. And after the sleigh ride, he hitchhiked, using the money from his sold medals and insignia to stay in a hotel for one night, then hitchhiked again until he reached the Prescott Grain elevator on the Canadian side of the St. Lawrence River. From the shore, the river looked completely frozen, a solid sheet of ice stretching from the Canadian bank to the American side, and von Werra started walking across what appeared to be a safe crossing, but halfway across he realized the ice wasn't solid all the way through, or that patches of open water existed where the current ran too fast for ice to form, and continuing forward would mean breaking through into water cold enough to kill him in minutes. Returning to the Canadian shore, he found a punt, which is a flat-bottom rowboat of the type used for fishing and transport in that part of the river. But he couldn't find oars anywhere near the boat, and without oars rowing across remained impossible in any conventional sense. What he did instead changed everything, dragging the boat across the ice as far as the solid ice extended, using his own body weight and strength to pull the punt behind him like a sled. And when he reached the section of river where the ice gave way to open water, he jumped into the boat and used his bare hands to paddle, plunging his hands into water that was barely above freezing and pulling the boat forward, stroke by stroke across the current that tried to push him downstream. The boat turned slowly as he paddled, out of control and drifting with the current, and von Werra kept paddling with his hands going numb from the cold, frostbite setting into his fingers and ears, his lips swelling from exposure, the boat eventually grounding on the ice of a jutting headland on the far side of the river. Leaping ashore onto American territory near the city of Ogdensburg, New York, nearly frozen to death, barely able to move his hands, von Werra stumbled across a field until he encountered Alan Kreitz, who owned a Texaco gas station on Isabella Street, and was out on a call fixing a car with a frozen gas line. Kreitz looked at this half-frozen man who appeared out of nowhere speaking accented English and claiming to be a German pilot who had escaped from Canada, and rather than dismiss the story as insane, he gave von Werra a ride into Ogdensburg, where von Werra turned himself over to the police and got immediately taken to Hepburn Hospital for treatment of frostbite on his hands and ears, and exposure severe enough that medical personnel weren't certain he would survive the night. Surviving and recovering enough to speak coherently within a day, von Werra found himself charged with entering the United States illegally and demanded a lawyer, which remained his right under American law, even though he was a foreign military prisoner who had entered the country by escaping from an allied nation. The judge informed him that the best lawyer in town was Jewish, and von Werra refused to let that lawyer represent him, a decision that tells you exactly where his political loyalties remained, despite the fact that he was now depending on American legal protections to avoid being sent back to Canada, and the German consul in New York City got contacted, and within days von Werra found himself released on $5,000 bond, later raised to $15,000, brought to the Hotel Astor in New York City, while American and Canadian authorities negotiated what to do with a German POW, who had reached neutral American territory through his own effort. Ogdensburg in January 1941 occupied a small corner of New York on the St. Lawrence River that had never seen anything like Franz von Werra, and the people there responded to his arrival with a curiosity that reflected how little most Americans understood about what was actually happening in Europe and what the Nazi regime represented. The United States wouldn't enter the war for another 11 months, and in early 1941, the conflict in Europe felt distant enough that a charming German pilot who had escaped from Canada seemed more interesting than threatening, more like an adventure story than a representative of an ideology built on blood and terror. An invitation to an Elks Club dinner arrived. Von Werra received a haircut and new clothes to replace the prison garments he'd been wearing. And he spent his time in Ogdensburg chatting up locals who found him funny, good-looking, and possessed of exactly the kind of personality that makes someone the center of attention at any gathering. Julie Madlin, an Ogdensburg historian who studied the case decades later, described the local reaction as being like a car accident you can't look away from. The combination of his status as an escaped prisoner, his charm, and the novelty of having a real German pilot in town, creating a fascination that overrode any concern about what he represented or what he'd been doing before he was shot down over Kent. Charles Cantwell, the managing editor of the Ogdensburg Journal, interviewed von Werra at length and published a detailed story the afternoon after his arrest, all giving von Werra a platform to tell an embellished version of his escape that emphasized his own cleverness and daring while downplaying the help he'd received from other prisoners and the role luck had played in getting him across the river alive. Cantwell heard that 25 prisoners had been watched by 3 guards in each coach, that 3 POWs had coordinated their efforts by whispering "go" and "stop" signals, and that around 7 in the evening on Thursday, von Werra had made his dive into waist-deep snow, all of which was accurate. But von Werra also claimed he had been about 200 miles north of Ottawa when he jumped, which would have placed him near Mont Laurier, though other sources suggest he was closer to 100 miles from the capital near Smiths Falls. Not everyone in Ogdensburg felt charmed by the German pilot. Oh, and Mayor Burns thought von Werra should be in jail rather than walking around town as a temporary celebrity, while an editorial in an Ottawa newspaper delivered a sharp criticism of the Canadian train guards who had allowed the escape, the Canadian government for what the editor called its casualness regarding security, and the citizens of Ogdensburg who had sumptuously wined and dined, a man the editor described as a cold-blooded product of Nazi culture and a hired assassin of a new order based on blood and terror. Von Werra sent a postcard to the RAF interrogator at Trent Park, who had bet him he wouldn't escape within 6 months, and the postcard featured a photograph of the Statue of Liberty with a message informing the interrogator that he had lost his bet, calculated to annoy and succeeding brilliantly, and arriving at a moment when British authorities were already furious that von Werra had reached neutral territory and couldn't be immediately returned to custody. While American and Canadian authorities negotiated extradition and debated whether the United States could legally send back a prisoner who had reached American soil under his own power, von Werra partied in New York City and made frequent debriefing trips to the German embassy in Washington, where intelligence officers questioned him extensively about British interrogation techniques, POW camp security, and everything he had learned during his 4 months in captivity. Late March 1941 brought clarity to German diplomatic personnel that the United States intended to return von Werra to Canada despite the legal complications, and the German vice consul made arrangements to prevent that from happening, giving von Werra cash and putting him on a train to El Paso, Texas, with instructions to cross the Rio Grande into Juarez, Mexico, and from there he began a journey that would take him through 7 countries and across more than 20,000 miles before he reached home. Mexico City to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, then Rio to Barcelona, Spain, Barcelona to Rome, Italy, and Rome to Berlin, Germany, arriving on April 18, 1941, 3 months after escaping from the Canadian prison train and 7 months after being shot down over Kent. The journey had required help from German diplomatic personnel at every stage, money that the Reich provided through its embassy networks, and a level of determination that never wavered even when the route became absurdly indirect, and the timeline stretched from weeks into months. Adolf Hitler personally awarded Franz von Werra the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross at a ceremony designed to celebrate the only Axis prisoner of war who had escaped from Western Allied custody and returned to combat, though technically the award had been authorized on December 14, 1940, while von Werra was still imprisoned in Canada, which meant he received the medal for his combat record rather than his escape. But none of that mattered because the propaganda value of his return was enormous, and the Nazi publicity machine made the most of it, presenting von Werra as proof that German fighting spirit could overcome any obstacle, and that even capture couldn't keep a determined German soldier from returning to the fight. The assignment Hitler gave him had nothing to do with flying and everything to do with intelligence. They tasking von Werra with improving German techniques for interrogating captured Allied pilots based on his extensive experience being interrogated by the British at Trent Park and other facilities. And he wrote a detailed report to the German High Command describing how he had been treated as a POW, what methods the British had used to extract information, and what security measures he had encountered at each camp. That report had an unexpected consequence that von Werra likely didn't intend, but that reflected better on him than anything else he did during the war. His description of the conditions in British POW camps, which were generally adequate and followed the Geneva Convention, caused the German High Command to improve the treatment of Allied POWs in German custody, all bringing conditions up to a standard closer to what the British were providing. Von Werra also wrote a book about his experiences titled Meine Flucht aus England, which translates as My Escape from England, but the manuscript remained unpublished during his lifetime and may not have survived the war at all. And what did survive was his burning desire to return to combat, which he got his chance to do in the summer of 1941, when the Luftwaffe sent him to the Eastern Front, where Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, had been underway since June 22nd. June 24, 1941, brought the death of Oberleutnant Wilfried Balfans, the commander of the 1st Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 53, killed in action over the Soviet Union, and on July 1st, von Werra was appointed Gruppenkommandeur to replace him, all taking command of a unit known by its insignia as the Ace of Spades and leading it through the savage air battles that characterized the opening months of Barbarossa. Between July and August 1941, von Werra claimed 11 to 13 additional aerial victories over Soviet aircraft, bringing his total career score to somewhere between 14 and 21 victories, depending on which source you trust, and how many of his claims from the Battle of Britain you accept as confirmed rather than probable. August 1941 brought leave between the Eastern Front and his next assignment, and von Werra married his longtime fiancée in a ceremony conducted with the customary Nazi pomp that accompanied any event involving a decorated officer and propaganda hero, and 2 months later, he was dead. Killed in a way that made a mockery of everything he had survived to reach that point. Early August saw the 1st Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 53 withdraw from the Eastern Front to Mannheim-Sandhofen airfield in Germany to rest and re-equip with the new Messerschmitt Bf 109 F4, the latest variant of the fighter von Werra had been flying since 1940, upgraded with a more powerful engine and improved aerodynamics. And on September 20th, the Gruppe relocated to the Netherlands, based at airfields at Katwijk and Halmstede, where their primary task involved patrolling Dutch airspace and intercepting any RAF aircraft that ventured across the North Sea, a routine assignment after the intensity of the Eastern Front. October 25, 1941, brought a routine patrol that required no particular skill and presented no obvious danger. It's the kind of flight von Werra had made hundreds of times before without incident, and he took off from Katwijk in Bf 109 F4/Z, Verk number 7285, on what was described as either a routine patrol or a practice flight, depending on which account you read, and somewhere over the North Sea his engine failed. The aircraft lost power, and von Werra had perhaps seconds to react before the fighter went into the water. Whether he attempted to bail out, whether he tried to ditch the aircraft, whether he had any time at all to do anything except realize he was about to die, nobody knows because nobody saw what happened and his body was never found. And the Bf 109 went into the sea near Katwijk and disappeared, taking with it the pilot who had escaped from British and Canadian custody 4 times, crossed a frozen river with his bare hands, stolen his way onto a British fighter, talked his way past police and railway workers and RAF personnel, traveled through 7 countries, and made it home against odds that should have kept him in a POW camp until the war ended. 7 months after returning to Germany, 4 months after taking command of a fighter Gruppe on the Eastern Front, Franz von Werra died from engine failure during a routine patrol at the age of 27, and the man who had dodged impossible situations was killed doing an everyday task, and the irony cut so sharp that people who knew him struggled to process it. This escape artist who had never stopped trying and never accepted defeat brought down not by enemy action or heroic last stands, but by a mechanical failure that could have happened to anyone. Then Hauptmann Herbert Kaminski succeeded him as commander of the 1st Gruppe, and the Luftwaffe issued a brief announcement of von Werra's death without elaborating on the circumstances, perhaps because there was nothing to elaborate beyond the fact that an engine had quit and a pilot had disappeared. And his sister Emma, who had been sold along with him to a German family when they were children, worked as a psychiatric nurse after the war, and lived until 1992, outliving her brother by 51 years, and carrying memories of a childhood in Switzerland that both of them had been forced to leave behind. 1956 brought the book The One That Got Away by Kendall Burt and James Leeser, 15 years after von Werra's death. Telling his story with the kind of detail that came from extensive research and interviews with people who had known him or encountered him during his escapes. And the 1957 film adaptation starred Hardy Kruger as von Werra and brought the story to audiences who had never heard of the German pilot who escaped from Canada. Both the book and the film contributed to a legend that has lasted longer than the man himself, preserving the memory of escapes that shouldn't have succeeded, and a journey that should have ended in a Canadian POW camp. The tunnel von Werra and his fellow prisoners dug at Swanwick in December 1940 still exists at the Hayes Conference Center in Derbyshire, a physical reminder of the night when 5 German POWs crawled through 13 meters of dirt, while a camp choir sang about going away into the great wide world. And 4 of those 5 men were recaptured within hours or days, but the 5th made it all the way home, and that distinction matters because it marks the difference between a failed escape that becomes a footnote and a successful one that becomes a story people remember 80 years later. Von Werra was, by multiple accounts, a man impossible not to admire for his enterprise and audacity, even by the people tasked with keeping him imprisoned, a man whose fellow POW Heinz Kramer described as honest and pleasant. A bit of a showman with a wonderful imagination, but a reliable and honest chap, and the imagination extended to boasting about kills he probably didn't score, and embellishing stories to make himself sound more clever than he was. But the determination remained real, the refusal to accept captivity remained real. And the 4 escape attempts across 2 continents remained real in a way that transcends the propaganda both sides tried to make from his story. 4 escape attempts, 3 failures, 1 success, and a journey that covered England, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Spain, Italy, and Germany, before ending in the North Sea when an engine quit during a routine patrol, 7 months after the only German prisoner of war to escape Western Allied custody and return to combat had finally made it home. 27 years was all Franz von Werra lived, spending 4.5 months as a prisoner of war, spending 9 months free after escaping, and never stopping trying to get back to the fight until a Bf 109's engine decided the fight was over. He was the one that got away. And 7 months later, he was the one who didn't come back. If this story fascinated you, hit subscribe. We cover the most incredible true stories from World War II that most people have never heard. And if you want to see what happened to the other great escapers of the war, check out the video we've linked in the description.